Most of what I'm going to be talking about is Carlo, and a little bit about the BSPED. I guess most of it is stuff that Carlo got up to outside Cambridge, albeit during the Cambridge years. And I will be touching on his standing in the UK and elsewhere, something that other people will be addressing as well during the course of this afternoon. I first met Carlo in 1994 when he'd arrived in Oxford, and around the time of the release of this seminal album by Blur. And people will probably know that he was a big fan of contemporary music, and I will be returning to that theme a little bit later. We actually had fairly similar professional journeys. We both spent time in Oxford. We both spent time in Cambridge, and we were both extremely, I think, fortunate to be mentored by David, and also actually by Jan Hughes as well. But of the two of us, I think I was probably the only one to swear at David. I'm sure you remember it was the 1993. It was just outside Death Valley, and the second word was off. And Carlo and I always used to chuckle about this, because the general consensus was that the reason I ended up tucked away in the northeast of England was because of this little exchange, and that's why he was based down in Cambridge, and I was sort of exercised somewhere else in the UK. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit later.
Yeah.
But we were both clinical academics, and I think we both had, if you like, feet in the diabetes and endocrinology camps. And we had, I guess, similar responsibilities. I always think that endocrinology is quite bizarre, because you meet somebody in Dublin, and then the next time you meet them is in Barcelona. And a lot of the occasions when I met Carlo, we were in exotic or maybe not so exotic locations around Europe and elsewhere. And I think this reflected the fact, in part, that Carlo is highly rated by these organizations, SB and the BSPED, and we'll be hearing more about this later on. Both, if you like, as a speaker, but he was also a very gifted chairperson as well. And I'm sure people will be very keen to endorse that at a later stage. But quite odd that you meet in these occasions, in these venues, obviously the conduit being this BSPED link. Ken, you may remember this. This was New York, 2009. And there's Carlo on the left there, Ken in the middle. And it was always great to see Carlo at meetings, because no disrespect to many of the people in maybe perhaps, or many of my colleagues, but the usual format is the pleasantries and then a bit of science and medicine. But as we've kind of heard already from Pauline and David, Carlo was a very interesting man. And he knew a lot about a lot. And in many respects, when I met him over espressos and the like, science was often a bit of an afterthought, because there always seemed to be so much else to talk about. But when we did talk about his responsibilities, and I think it's worth thinking and reflecting about this, because when you qualify as a doctor, I'm not sure any of us really can predict or has a good idea of what we'll be doing in future. But Carlo clearly he ran a clinical service, so he had clinics and ward reviews. He had university responsibilities, as we've heard, in terms of supervision, mentoring and teaching. He was in demand as a speaker, as we've already heard, writing, planning, and he was in demand because of his expertise. Learned bodies were very keen to engage with him. And perhaps on day one of his consultant post in Cambridge, he could slot it into 40 hours a week. But increasingly, as the demands increase, it just becomes very, very difficult. And I'm sure this is a theme that many people will have thought about. Indeed, I've heard people talk about this. And I mean, nobody's quite conjured up the 30-hour day yet. But I mean, even you, David, I don't think you've solved a lot of problems in your time. But yeah, I think you need to start focusing on this now, because increasingly for people who've got a lot of skills and expertise like Carlo, it becomes very difficult to simply cram everything in. But clearly, as Carlo's expertise became recognized, more requests for talks, more requests for academic input, and more requests for input into roles that require his very refined interpersonal skills. And I added to that workload. And I think it's worth reflecting on the fact that he was an extremely gifted speaker. He would pitch his talks appropriately, they were nicely paced. And I always remember at a time when everybody was getting desperately excited about the new technologies in diabetes, quite rightly, of course, but he was always very keen to think not so much about the tool, but about the family behind the tool as well. And I think his reflections on the importance of this relative balance were highlighted by the outcome of the Skippy trial, for example, which showed that there was no great difference in terms of glycemic control in the first year of life when people were randomized to either pump therapy or basal bolus treatment. And of course, we'll be hearing a lot more about not just his diabetes work today, but the fact that he had a number of endocrine interests as well. But one of the dilemmas for me when I was the BSPED chair, and actually was involved in organising the meeting against at Newcastle for the British Society for Paediatric Endocrinology and Diabetes, was the problem of the Friday afternoon peel-off, where people disappear, get trains back hither and thither, and that was potentially going to be a big problem when the meeting was tucked away in the northeast, where I had been sent, and Carlo was the perfect answer, in fact, because we decided that he was going to give the final talk of the day, and he delivered a wonderful lecture entitled Diabetes and Technology, State of the Art and Future Prospects. And it did indeed solve the problem, because bums were on seats right through to the end of the meeting. In fact, Carlo made a number of trips to the frozen north. I remember he came up in the relatively early time, perhaps, of his spell in Cambridge. He came up and was the external examiner for an endocrine thesis. This is the Customs House on the seafront in South Shields. I was asked yesterday whether that was in Cumbria, but it's not in Cumbria, people. It is in the northeast of England, okay? And it just tucked away to the far left-hand side, you'll see the Steamboat pub where we had a pint beforehand. And he spent the evening with my family, and the next day he was, as I say, the external examiner. And then just 2 years ago, he came up again as an external examiner. This was for a diabetes thesis. This was Tarini Chetty, who I think people will be aware of, and I think he's now a consultant up in Edinburgh, and we paced the streets of Newcastle looking for a nice restaurant the night before. This is Grey Street in Newcastle upon Tyne, again in the frozen north. But then lo and behold, when we got some funding to undertake an MRC study, as people are aware, you need to rely on people, favours, and who could I ask to chair the data monitoring committee? Well, of course, it had to be Carlo. So phone call, and of course, as was the case with the man, he said yes straight away. He was the secretary of the BSPED for a number of years, and again, it's worth reflecting on what a great job he did. He was very sensible, a great a sounding board. He was obviously a very articulate man, but I think he was also very credible as well, because not only did he have this research portfolio, not only was he a good clinician, but he obviously had feet in both diabetes and endocrinology camps, which I think was a help. And I hope Assunta Albanese has joined this Zoom meeting today, because I remember very fondly the pre-meeting meal where I used to hope that we'd go to an Italian chain so I could hear them both slag the food off. And yes, those were very, very happy days indeed. But it's worth remembering, I think, that Carlo was, I guess, well, certainly from my perspective, was first and foremost a clinician. And I remember being contacted about just less than 2 years ago by a family in the south who had a young man who was struggling a bit following his diagnosis of Addison's disease, and they were clearly in need of a steer from a wise clinician, somebody who knew what they were up to. And I directed the family towards Carlo, and no surprise, he delivered in spades and put the family back on the straight and narrow. Saw them very promptly, and ultimately, as I say, despite the pressures and expectations of his academic work, it was clear that he was always very keen to see patients. And before today, I've put some thought into why it is that we're holding this meeting, and because he was a very, very kind man. And obviously, as a clinical academic, there are a lot of pressures. The expectation is that you have to highlight why you're an international megastar, and there's an emphasis on publication plans and the like, and self-promotion. And I think that Carlo really wasn't that kind of guy, really, in my opinion. He was, as I've highlighted here, his first and foremost was not number one. It was his first and foremost, I think, was often seemed to be the desire to help other people. I mentioned music earlier on, and I'm going to, in the last couple of slides now, I'm going to return to music, because Steve Ball, who's in Manchester now, and we used to reflect sometimes on how useful it would be to have a little scan of somebody's iPod or iPhone these days before they came into clinic. And I discussed this with Carlo relatively recently, because we were saying, transition clinic, what would you prefer? Would you want a skeletal age, or do you fancy an iPod age? And the general consensus was that if you knew that on somebody's iPod there was kind of One Direction and Ariana Grande, then there would be no prospect of separating this person from their parents in the transition clinic. But clearly, if you moved on to kind of Bob Dylan, I don't know, public service broadcasting, Radiohead, then it was a good prospect you could see this young person themselves, and you'd be able to see them without mum and dad chipping in all the time. But of course, Carlo's iPhone was very difficult to gauge, actually, because, as I say, he had such a broad, he knew a lot about contemporary music, and had a lot of this on his iPhone. And indeed, I remember the last album we talked about was Muse's Drones, which I was whinging about and saying I was a bit underwhelmed. And he encouraged me, I think quite rightly, to go back and have another listen. So for me, this is my last slide. I reckon that Carlo, he passes the desert island test, because family aside, if you were stuck on a desert island for a year, who would you want to be with? And for me, Carlo would be top of my shopping list, because he's an interesting guy. He's a kind man. He would, whatever food was available, or bounty, he'd share it with you. And I think if a conversation waned, which it wouldn't do early on, but it might do towards the end of the year, I think he'd be you'd always have his iPhone to listen to. So I guess, in keeping with many other people, feel extremely privileged to have known him. Thank you very much.